What is up, everybody? Welcome back here to our YouTube channel. You know what time it is. College football risers and fallers. We're looking at guys from week 6 that improved their value, that didn't do too well in their value there, and also just some guys that you should be aware of from a dynasty perspective, from a Devy perspective, of guys that are really coming to their own a little bit. And here's a fun guy here. LaQuint Allen from Syracuse. He's a running back out there, class of 2025. And when you're thinking of him from just a Devy perspective, he's always kind of been someone on the radar when you're thinking of running backs had that value. He came in this year with a lot of guys from the CFF range, like really liking his upside. And this last week, they played UNLV. They got me the cover, or excuse me, they got me the win, right? The +6.5. So shout out Syracuse. He looked good. 19 attempts, 71 yards, 2 touchdowns. His PFF grades on the season, really, really good too. 76.5 run grade, yards after contact, 257, 3.52 for attempt, 17 missed tackles forced, 10 plus explosive runs there. And in elusive rate, he's not great. But when you're looking at LaQuint and just going over like his numbers, when you're looking at just kind of his weekly grades and what he's been able to do, he's been very solid from the last few years, right? He had those 1,000 yards rushing last year. This year, 73 attempts, 300 yards, 3 touchdowns. He really needed that game. So this is probably his best game on the year in terms from a touchdown perspective. But look good against Ohio, Georgia Tech, very solid runner. He's the type of kid that you're like, man, this kid could be one of those guys that just plugs and plays, right? We think of guys that we've seen in NFL, like, hey, that guy, look at Tank Bigsby. Look at some of these other guys that look dead and then they just pop off. You're like, oh my gosh, that guy's not dead. Braylon Allen, for example, coming out and looking pretty good for the Jets, even though that organization's a mess. So LaQuint's definitely kind of raises value. If you have him in some type of college league, you're probably pretty excited because he's showing some upside there from a production standpoint, but also just from like maybe he can get drafted, right? He's still a day 3 kid if he gets drafted, but he definitely had some value this last week. Now, next guy I'm going to talk about is Emeka Egbuka. We took some crap for this because we drafted him pretty high in our mock that we did here on the channel, and I think it was justified. He's been the best wide receiver for Ohio State. I know Jeremiah Smith is explosive and fun and all that, but you know who's been more consistent? This guy. 9 catches, 71 yards, 3 touchdowns against Iowa. PFF grades have been solid. 86.4 receiving grade. Yards per out run, 3.83. ADOT, 7.3. Only 2 drops. 5 missed tackles for us. Yak per reception is 8.6. Now, I had this question on social media, and it was a good question because I had mocked him to the Bills. They said, hey, is he just a slot guy? Probably. Like when you look at the numbers and you kind of see where he's at this year in terms of slot and wide, 80 to 19-ish. That's pretty much where he's at there for his slot percentage and wide percentage. But I don't think that disqualifies him as being a solid wide receiver 2 in fantasy. That doesn't stop him from possibly in top 5 pick in superflex drafts. Like he'll probably slip out a little bit if the quarterbacks pop up there. But man, what else do you want from this kid to do, right? He's healthy. He's earning targets. He got 41 targets already, over 400 yards receiving, 30 catches, 5 touchdowns. He looks very solid. Now, and the game script wise, they haven't really needed to use him, right? And even then, against, the teams that they have, Marshall, these other teams, he's looked good. He's got a massive game this week against Oregon. So we're going to see how he does. I think he's going to perform very well. I think Ohio State's going to whoop Oregon. If I had to guess, they'll at least cover or whatever I think they're at -4.5 recently. But when you're thinking of like what they did, like I think that Emeka is a big part of that. I think he plays well. He got pro potential. He's a first round talent. I think at this point we got to stop saying he's not. And then when you look at just kind of where his receiving depths are, like, and again, this is where that slot percentage comes into. Very short to medium is kind of where he eats. Pretty much short, like when you look at that 15 catches on 20 targets, 155 yards and that touchdown there. But medium, like he is explosive. He has that ability. The 3 touchdowns and 19.6 yards per reception in that 10 to 19 range, 7 for 10. Like he does really well in that range, right? Like that is probably his go-to. They look for him on 3rd down. They look to him break down the defenses. He gets behind the defenses in zone coverage. He's pretty good against man. I do think he creates enough separation. I know he's 3 for 3 for contested catches, but he does enough, right? We're not asking him to do a ton, but he does enough. And I think that from a Devy perspective and from a dynasty perspective, I think you're excited about his potential. I think that's a very, very solid potential that he has. Now, next guy is popping off a little bit, and I needed to give him a shout out because I have not talked about Le'Veon Moss probably for 2 years. Like I have not talked about him, but But slowly but surely, with Ruben Owens being out, new head coach in Elko, Le'Veon Moss is coming around. 12 attempts last week for that big win against Missouri, 138 yards and 3 touchdowns. And on the season, he's looked good. 81.2 running grade. Yards after contact, 440. Yards after contact per attempt is 5. That is a very, very solid number there. 19 missed tackles forced, 10 plus explosive runs at 14, 112.9 elusive rating. And if somebody in this class, this is why that running back class is a lot of fun. The 25 running class is just loaded with guys like this, that if he decides to declare this year, he's going to find a role. He's going to find a value, a role out there, some type of role for an NFL team. And when you look at just his numbers, like his PFF grade here, you'll see he's just improving, right? Had 70 yards, 84 yards, been super consistent the last few weeks. And when you're just looking at the numbers overall, I mean, those are the numbers that you want to see. Those numbers there, 609 yards and 6 touchdowns on the year. Very consistent for missed tackles for us. He had that big 75-yard touchdown run. He's looked just better. He did not look good the first 2 years. He looks more explosive this year, and that's the thing that really kind of pops off to me. Last year, he was fine. He had 400 yards. He already passed that season, career totals in all areas this year. And the 10 plus explosive runs are where it's at. That he's at 14 already this year. He had 12 last year, 4 the previous year. So he's getting more opportunity, showing that elusive rating. If he can do that, I mean, he's a solid back. I mean, if he can show that elusive rating, he shows that ability to kind of separate. He shows that explosiveness on top of being able to 3-down guy. Like Le'Veon Moss has definitely helped his value, probably more than any other running back right now. I mean, Nash and Genty, yes. We're not talking about Nash and Genty. He's through the roof. But a guy that's like, looked dead, right? He was drafted in Devy 2 years ago, somewhat high because people were really expecting good things from him. Now he's back. That's what we're looking for when we're talking risers and fallers of value and talent out there. And that's exactly what you should be excited about if you have Le'Veon Moss. Now, let's get negative. Ollie Gordon has not been good. And I've talked about Ollie. We've talked about it on our draft podcast. I talked about it weeks ago. I was never really in on Ollie. 13 attempts, 50 yards, went banged up. Oklahoma State's kind of out of it. Rumors are Ollie's maybe hanging it up, right? There's some people saying, hey, you should just walk away. Just get ready for the NFL season. I think that would be a disservice to him based on his season he's had. 71.8 run grade, not great. Yards after contact have just not been there. 2.63. Missed tackle force have been okay, but his elusive rating, 68.0. And when you're looking at the numbers, they don't get much better. Like elusive rating, he had a couple registered under 10, right? Against West Virginia, 8.7. Against Arkansas, 9.9. 2 of his worst games, especially that Arkansas game. I know he scored a touchdown, but yards per attempt, 3.6, not great, especially when you're looking at he had 6.1 and 5.0 his first 2 years. Everybody's going to look at last year's number, the 1,700 yards, 21 touchdowns, all that. It's simply not there. Now, this is a combination of a lot of things. I think that from an offensive perspective, they load in the box. Bowman is terrible. They're saying, hey, run the football. They're keying on Ollie Gordon. I think that is for sure. And that's not an Ollie Gordon problem. That's an 8-in-the-man box problem. Offensive line issues. 100% have been offensive line issues there. They had a little bit of changeover up there. They're kind of learning. But some of this is on Ollie Gordon, especially when you pair that with the offseason. The problems there, the arrest or the DUI, everything that happened there, then he's not looking good. Like the culmination of all those things is going to hurt Ollie Gordon's pro prospects. That's just a fact. That's just a reality of these things when you're looking at just from a pro perspective and what we can expect from him. Those are the things that you had to be careful of. I think those, when you're thinking of like from a Devy perspective, from a value perspective, that's the precipitous drop, right? He was drafted in the first round of a lot of leagues, and it doesn't look like he's coming back from that right now. But like we talked about this on the draft podcast, Chuba Hubbard, some of these other guys, like we've seen kind of a drop from them their junior year or their senior year, and then they find a role, right? So these guys can always find a role. It really comes down to where they're getting drafted. But I think from a value perspective, you going through all the guys that are in that first round that drafted off season, Ollie's probably taking the biggest hit. I think Ollie's really kind of dropped out of that range, like maybe some like Mika Hudson from the freshman wide receiver perspective. But Ollie, to me, took the biggest hit so far from a value perspective. So because people thought he was Ashton Genty. People thought he could hit that maybe that 2,000-yard mark. Maybe he'd be there right there for an NFL, like a round 1 capital. Like that was the expectation of Ollie Gordon. And that expectation just has not come to fruition this year. We're not seeing that. So this is a Devy Rise and Fallers from week 6. We have a fun week 7 plan. We have a lot of fun games on there. We're going to see a lot of things out there that's going to help us in terms of risers and fallers. As always, you have Devy questions, find us on the Patreon, find us on social media. We're always here to help you. I know there's not a lot of Devy content creators anymore, so I'm here to help you there. Appreciate you guys. See you guys next time.